There's a particular kind of horror that doesn't come from what you see. It comes from what you don't see. No broken door, no shattered window, and no blood. No frantic search, no frantic neighbor calling in the night. Just a house in Springfield, Missouri, where 3 women went to sleep and then disappeared so cleanly that decades later, law enforcement can still only give you a window of time. Not an answer, just a window. And according to the FBI's missing person entry, whatever happened occurred between 2:15 in the morning and 7:30 in the morning. The FBI, that's the whole official bracket for a crime that erased 3 lives. Tonight, we're going to treat this like a real investigation, not a campfire story. We're going to separate verified timeline from reputable rumor, and we're going to keep it open-ended because the Springfield 3 doesn't allow a neat ending. I'm your host, Mr. Bones, and this is The Night Tales Show. Before you can understand why this case is so hard, you have to understand the combination of victims, because this isn't just 3 missing people, it's a combination that eliminates the easy explanations. Suzanne Streeter was 19 years old, young enough that some investigators in other cases might float the idea that a spontaneous runaway was occurring. But the evidence in this case doesn't support that. Her personal effects were left behind, including items people don't typically abandon if they're leaving by choice. Then take Stacy McCall. She was also 19 years old. And Stacy's disappearance matters because she had a home base and expectations. She wasn't drifting, she wasn't disconnected. When Stacy didn't show, people noticed fast and pressure began to build. And then there's Sherrill Levitt, aged 47, Susie's mother. Sherrill's presence in this case is the wrecking ball that smashes most voluntary disappearance theories. Adults with established routines, appointments, and stable life patterns rarely vanish without taking essentials. 3 women, 2 teenagers, and a mother. Different ages, different needs, and different decision-making styles. One vanishing, and if you're looking for your first research anchor in this case, it's this. Any theory must explain all 3. Alright, so we're going to start in June 6, 1992. It's graduation night. Susie and Stacy go to the celebration, and they're seen. They're moving through a social web of friends, classmates, pauses, and after parties. Sherrill is doing something completely normal for a Saturday evening at home. She makes a phone call around 11:15 p.m., and according to case documentation, nothing in that call suggests danger or panic. That call matters because it's one of the last calm signals we have from inside that home. Something that tells us Sherrill's evening wasn't already spiraling. So later, Susie and Stacy decide not to stay at another friend's place because it's too crowded. That part is important because it means that their final destination wasn't necessarily the plan earlier in the night. They all return to Sherrill's residence at about 2:15 in the morning, and that's where the verified timeline starts to narrow, because after 2:15 a.m., we don't have confirmed sightings, only consequences. Which leads us to talk about the FBI window again from 2:15 in the morning to 7:30 a.m. That tells us something subtle. Investigators believe the women were likely taken overnight or early morning before the house became active with visitors, calls, and daylight. It also suggests the disappearance happened before the normal rhythm of neighbors waking, leaving for errands, hearing doors, and hearing cars. Now here's what makes that window brutal for detectives. If it's closer to 2:15, you're dealing with darkness, sleepy neighborhoods, fewer witnesses. If it's closer to dawn, you should have more chance of someone noticing something or noticing movement. Either way, the offender, whoever they were, operated in a window where the environment did them favors. When friends go looking later that morning, the house is not screaming crime scene, it's not ransacked, it's not chaotic. And that's one of the reasons this case became what it became. Inside the home, Sherrill's bed appears slept in. Her eyeglasses are nearby, a book is turned over in a way that suggests that she may have been interrupted. The family dog Cinnamon is still there and is described as anxious. The women's personal items are still present. Not the kind of grab-and-go scene you'd expect if 3 people chose to vanish. Now, another detail investigators noted later was that there were cigarettes and lighters that were left behind inside the home, something that struck people as unusual given Sherrill's known habits. Now, there's also the detail of the blinds. They were pulled apart as if someone had been looking out. Now, none of these prove what happened, but together they paint a picture. A normal night interrupted, not a planned disappearance. Now, outside the home, the porch light globe is shattered. It's one of the only physical disturbances noted at the scene. And then comes the moment that every cold case detective feels in their bones. Well-meaning people try to help, and in helping, they erase what they didn't know mattered, unaware it might be evidence. Now, this isn't about blame, it's about the reality of 1992. People didn't assume abduction first. They assumed misunderstanding, hangover sleep, and changed plans. But from an investigative standpoint, that porch light is massive. It's a massive what if. Was it broken during a confrontation? Was it broken earlier and unrelated? Was it broken intentionally to reduce visibility? Or was it broken accidentally by someone moving quickly? Now, we can't answer those questions anymore, and that missing answer is part of what makes this case so durable. By the time law enforcement is fully engaged, a painful reality sets in. The home has been entered and tidied by multiple loved ones. Ashtrays emptied, cups moved, doors opened and closed, people walking through rooms. It's easy to hear that and think, well, how could that happen? But here's what research tells us about community behavior and missing person events. In the early hours, people behave like helpers, not like forensic technicians. They clean, they straighten, they look for clues like humans look for clues, through familiarity and evidence handling. The Springfield 3 case is a textbook example of how the first day can reshape the rest of the investigation, because in a case where the evidence is already thin, losing even a little is catastrophic. Which leads us to the answering machine. This case has a reoccurring pattern. Potential evidence exists briefly and then disappears. According to case summaries, police believed a message on the answering machine might have contained a clue, but it was inadvertently erased. By the time the seriousness was understood, a full day had nearly passed, and the scene had become compromised. That erased message has become almost mythical in the public imagination. But here's the responsible research stance. We don't know exactly what was on it. We don't know if it was connected. We don't know if it would have changed everything. What we do know is that investigators thought it mattered enough to note, and losing it reduced the number of concrete leads even further. Big misconception in true crime is the idea that if there's no blood or obvious disturbance, there was no violence. Force can be quiet. Control can be psychological. A weapon displayed but not used can silence a room. A threat can be made in seconds. And in a 3-victim situation, control can be achieved by targeting the person most likely to resist first, creating compliance through fear rather than through noise. The Springfield 3 might be a case where the offender never needed to fight. They only needed to control. A chaotic offender leaves chaos. A controlling offender leaves silence. This leads us to a question that shapes everything that follows. How did the offender get cooperation, or at least compliance, without waking the neighborhood? Because if we can understand the method of control, we get closer to the kind of offender this likely was. Someone comfortable taking risks in a residential area. Someone capable of managing multiple victims. Someone with either familiarity, authority, or a convincing ruse. Someone who had a plan for removal and concealment. If you spend enough time in true crime, you start to learn an ugly truth. The first day decides the entire shape of an investigation. Now, not always is this the case, but often. And in the Springfield case, the first day didn't just shape the case. It may have permanently limited what the case could have ever became. Because by the time people realized something terrible had happened, the house had already been lived in by panic. Friends came in and out, looking for clues like humans do, moving things, tidying, searching, talking over one another, and trying to help. And this isn't a moral failure, it's humanity. But to an investigation, it's a nightmare. A detail I want to sit down with is this. Nearly a full day passed before the seriousness of the situation was truly recognized in the way investigators needed it to be. Loved ones visited the home, and only later did authorities admit the scene was likely tainted, partly because people didn't yet understand they were standing in a crime scene at all. Officers reportedly left a note on the door asking Sherrill to call and cancel the missing person report when she and the girls returned. That detail is devastating, not because police were careless, but because it reflects the reality of how rare this scenario seemed at the time. 3 women gone, but the world still behaving as if this was a misunderstanding. And whoever took them, if someone took them, that person benefited from every minute. In a case this thin, even small things become major. We know the porch light globe was broken. We know the glass was swept up and discarded before police treated it as evidence. That's documented. And once that happened, the porch light stopped being evidence and became a question mark. Was it even broken during a confrontation? Was it broken earlier in the night or later in the morning? And who broke it? We can't replay that, and without that, investigators lose one of the only physical disruptions tied to the entryway. Then we have the answering machine issue. We know investigators believed a message may have been relevant and that it was inadvertently erased before it could be properly analyzed. 2 potential evidence streams, the glass, globe, and audio, both gone. This is what makes the Springfield 3 case so uniquely punishing. It's not just that the evidence is scarce, it's that the evidence that did exist had a very short half-life. Let's talk about what was documented inside the home, because it matters. Not for drama, but for behavioral reconstruction. So, Sherrill's bed appeared slept in. Her eyeglasses were beside the bed. A book was turned over in a way that suggested that she may have been interrupted while reading. Now, that doesn't prove an abduction occurred inside the house, but it does suggest that the night was normal until it wasn't. The television was on and personal items were untouched. The dog, Cinnamon, was inside the house and appeared anxious. And then we get into the details that don't scream, but they do hint. Investigators noted cigarettes and a lighter remained in the house. The three women's purses were reportedly placed together on the stairs, and the blinds in Suzanne's room were pulled apart as if someone had been looking out. Now, none of these are smoking gun facts, but together they paint a picture of interruption, not departure. This does not read like three people calmly deciding to disappear. Now we get into one of the most chilling early investigative ideas, because it's the kind of theory that feels simple enough to be real. One of the original investigators theorized the assailant may have taken Cinnamon from the yard and then returned, pretending to have found the dog and using the dog as a way to get someone to open the door. So let's break this down why that theory won't die, because it explains compliance. If someone knocks and says, "Hey, your dog was out," you open the door. You step out onto the porch and you focus on the animal, not the person. You don't scream, you don't wake the neighborhood. A ruse like that doesn't require authority. It doesn't require a uniform, and it doesn't require familiarity. It requires timing and the right bait. Now here's the limitation. It's still a theory, it's not proven, and we don't have evidence that Cinnamon was ever outside or removed. But from a behavioral standpoint, it is one of the most plausible quiet entry explanations ever proposed, because it matches the exact problem this case presents: how to gain control without noise. And if that theory is true, it implies planning, not impulse. And it implies an offender who understood people. In the first days, investigators pursued what they could: sightings, tips, and people who didn't fit. There was a composite sketch of an unidentified transient man that was released after reports of a man seen near the residence in early June. A sketch like that does not mean guilt. It means a thread existed that investigators couldn't ignore. But it does show you how the case developed. When forensic evidence is absent, investigations become human intelligence dependent. Witnesses, sightings, memory, all are fragile, because witnesses forget, because tips distort, because anxiety fills in gaps. And if the offender was local, familiar, or careful, they can hide inside the noise of those tips too. Now, let's talk about the detail that became almost iconic: the green van. A credible local retrospective from KY3 describes witnesses reporting a green van in the area, later described as a 1964 to 1970 Dodge panel van, light moss green with a white front grille. And what police did next tells you something about how desperate memory-based cases became. They parked a green van matching the description in front of the police department, hoping it would jog the public's memory. That's not just a quirky tactic, that's an admission of the investigative environment. We need people to remember what they saw, because in a case without DNA, without bodies, without a verified crime scene, the strongest weapon is often the public's recollection. But the memory is messy, and if the van was unrelated, it becomes a false gravity well, pulling attention away from other leads. And if it was connected, but the description was wrong by one detail, it becomes almost impossible to find. Still, this van remains one of the very few tangible lead frameworks investigators could show the public. Now, there was a report that a woman matching Suzanne's description was seen driving an older model moss green Dodge van on June 7th, appearing terrified, while an unseen male voice allegedly warned, "Don't do anything stupid." It's an arresting detail, but here's what a researcher has to say out loud. This report was not made immediately, and it came days later. Now, this matters because delaying reporting introduces error. You see a face on TV, you start matching memories to the image, and you begin believing your certainty is stronger than it was. And yet, additional witnesses reported seeing the van in other areas after the disappearance. So you end up with a real investigative dilemma. Multiple reports can mean corroboration. Multiple reports can also mean contagion, people influenced by publicity. This is the kind of nuance most internet threads skip, but investigators don't get to skip it because acting on the wrong van can burn years. Now we come to one of the most haunting almosts in the entire case. After America's Most Wanted profiled the case in late December of 1992, an anonymous caller contacted the hotline, but the call was disconnected before Springfield investigators could speak to him. Authorities believe the caller had vital information, and despite public pleas, he never contacted them again. Newsweek's 2025 reporting also summarizes this moment in the same essential terms. The caller was believed to have prime knowledge, and the disconnect prevented investigators from speaking with him. Let's talk about why this matters, because if that caller truly had prime knowledge, then the case wasn't just known by police and families. It was known by someone who felt compelled, for a moment, to talk, and then didn't. That could mean a lot of things. It could mean fear. They were having second thoughts. Maybe there was someone else in the room, or they had a loss of nerve. It could have been a prank, or maybe it was a tipster who exaggerated the truth. We don't know, but the possibility that someone with real information was on the line and slipped away adds a kind of existential dread to this case. The truth was close enough to dial a phone, and yet it still vanished. So what have we actually learned so far, research-wise? Well, we've established that the early hours likely allowed a suspect enormous advantage, and that investigators later believed the scene was compromised by a well-meaning visitor and lost evidence. We've established documented household indicators consistent with interruption and non-voluntary departure. Personal effects were left behind, there was a dog that was anxious, and reading was interrupted. We've also established that investigators seriously considered a low-noise entry ruse involving the dog because it fits the behavioral problems of the case. We've established that the green van became a serious enough lead that police used public memory tactics to identify it, and that credible local reporting preserves a specific descriptor for the vehicle. And we've established that the case produced at least one significant near-contact event via America's Most Wanted that, if legitimate, suggests knowledge existed outside the immediate victim circle. That is not closure, but it is structure. In a disappearance with no bodies, no forensic trail, and no confirmed crime scene, investigators tend to gravitate toward one thing: movement. If the women didn't walk away, if they didn't vanish inside the house, then they were moved, which means there might have been a vehicle involved. And vehicles do two important things in investigations. They create geography, and they create witnesses. The Springfield 3 case has very little of either, which is why the vehicle theory has carried so much weight for so long. Over time, the green van became the most tangible external lead in the case. But as a researcher, it's important to slow this down and strip it of myth. The most commonly cited description is a 1960s era Dodge panel van, light or moss green in color, with a white grille. Multiple witnesses placed a van like this near East Delmar Street in the early morning hours after the women were last seen. That's the core fact. Everything else branches outward. Some witnesses claim that the van was parked suspiciously. Others said it was driving erratically. At least one report suggested that the van was seen later in the day in a different part of town. But here's the key limitation. No single witness could definitively connect the van to the women. And that matters because in cold cases, vehicles can become symbolic anchors, something investigators and the public latch onto because it's concrete, even when certainty is low. Now, the most unsettling report involving the van is also the most fragile. A witness later claimed to have seen a young woman resembling Suzanne Streeter driving a green van and appearing terrified, while an unseen male voice warned her not to do anything stupid. If true, this sighting would change the case dramatically. It would suggest that Suzanne was alive after leaving the house, that she was under direct coercion, and that the offender maintained control outside the home. The crime involved movement through public space, but as a researcher, you have to be honest about the weaknesses. This report was made days later, after media coverage. The identification was not confirmed, the driver was not stopped, no follow-up evidence emerged. Eyewitness memory is one of the least reliable forms of evidence, especially when faces are seen briefly, whether it's under stress and later filtered through news exposure. So this sighting can't be dismissed, but it cannot be treated as fact either. It exists in a gray zone, and the Springfield 3 is full of gray zones. One of the most revealing moments in this case isn't something the public noticed at the time. This tells us two things. First, investigators believed the van was important enough to pursue aggressively. And second, they believed someone had seen something and didn't realize its significance at the time. That's a classic tactic in cases where the crime itself didn't look like a crime yet. The problem is memory degrades quickly. By the time people understand what they might have seen, details blur, colors shift, timelines compress. And if the van was seen slightly differently, a different year, a different shade, a different grille, it could slip through unnoticed forever. Here's a possibility that investigators and researchers have to entertain, even if it's uncomfortable. What if the van had nothing to do with the disappearance? What if it was a neighbor's vehicle, or a late-night delivery, or someone attending a nearby party? It could be someone completely unrelated. And in high-profile cases, coincidence can masquerade as pattern. The danger lies in this. If investigators fixate on the wrong vehicle, they may unconsciously dismiss other explanations, including ones that don't involve a vehicle at all. This doesn't mean the van wasn't involved. It means certainty is dangerous. Now, this next question is rarely asked, but it should be. Most theories assume the women were placed into a vehicle. But there are other possibilities. They could have been coerced into walking a short distance, they could have moved to a nearby structure, or taken to a second location on foot and then transported later. East Delmar Street was not isolated, but it did provide access to back routes, alleys, and side streets. If an offender had control, movement wouldn't need to be immediate or obvious, and that possibility complicates the timeline even further. One thing that emerges when you analyze the movement question is this: whoever did this was comfortable with risk. Approaching a home at night is risky, and controlling 3 people is risky. Moving them increases risk exponentially, so this was not someone acting blindly. Whether the offender planned this or adapted quickly, they demonstrated confidence, not panic. That suggests experience. Not necessarily criminal experience, but situational confidence. One of the strongest arguments against a random serial offender is the absence of similar crimes. If someone abducted 3 women and succeeded, you might expect repetition, but no comparable case has ever been conclusively linked. That leads to uncomfortable possibilities. Did the offender stop? Did the offender die? They could have changed their methods, or maybe this was a one-time escalation. All of these are possible, but none are provable. People often call the Springfield 3 a perfect crime, and that's misleading. Perfect crimes don't exist. They just exist without resolution. What we're really looking at is a crime that left no usable evidence. That doesn't mean no mistakes were made. It means that the mistakes were never discovered. And that's an important distinction. Even today, when detectives talk about the Springfield 3, the van comes up. Not because it's proven, but because it's one of the few external anchors the case has. It represents movement and possibility, and psychologically that matters. It keeps the case from collapsing inward entirely. So here's what we can say responsibly after deep review. A vehicle was likely involved, but not conclusively proven. The green van is a strong lead, but not a confirmed one. Eyewitness reports offer possibilities, but not certainty, and the offender was comfortable operating under risk. None of this solves the case, but it sharpens the silhouette. When a case has no physical evidence, no bodies, and no timeline beyond a narrow window, something predictable happens. Suspects multiply. The Springfield 3 has generated dozens of named and unnamed suspects over the years. Some investigated formally, others debated endlessly by the public. What's important from a research standpoint is not listing names for shock value. It's understanding why none of them held. Because this case doesn't lack answers, it actively resists them. Many suspects looked compelling at first glance. Some had criminal histories, some lived nearby. Some had troubling behaviors. Some even made statements that sounded incriminating. But here's the reoccurring pattern investigators ran into. Each suspect explained part of the case, but never all of it. One might explain access to the neighborhood. Another might explain ability to control victims. Another might explain concealment. But none could explain everything without adding assumptions, and assumptions are where cases fall apart in court. Over the years, several incarcerated individuals claimed responsibility for the Springfield 3. From a distance, that sounds promising. Up close, it's usually not. False confessions are common in high-profile cold cases. People confess for attention, leverage, mental health reasons, or to inject themselves into a story larger than their own lives. When investigators evaluated these confessions, they found details that were publicly known, inconsistencies with the house layout, timelines that didn't match, and there was no corroborating evidence. The key takeaway isn't that police ignored confessions, it's that none of them contained verifiable, non-public information. And that matters more than emotion ever could. But there is one individual whose name surfaces repeatedly in discussions of the case, especially in later years. He was a convicted criminal, he had a violent past, he made statements that sounded ominous, and at one point, law enforcement even convened a grand jury related to information surrounding him. That fact alone fuels speculation. But here's the part that rarely gets examined or explained clearly. A grand jury doesn't mean charges are imminent. It does not mean guilt. It does mean that investigators believe testimony or evidence required legal protection to be examined further. And after that process, no charges. No public identification as a suspect. No cases filed. From a research standpoint, that tells us something crucial. Even when investigators leaned as far forward as they legally could, they still didn't have enough. Police eventually named a person of interest to apply pressure or solicit tips. In the Springfield 3, they didn't. That wasn't an oversight, it was strategic. Naming a person of interest without physical evidence risks lawsuits, contamination of testimony, tunnel vision, compromising future prosecutions, and investigators ended up choosing restraint. That restraint frustrated the public, but it also signals how fragile the case was from an evidentiary standpoint. They couldn't afford to be wrong. Let's talk more about the grand jury because it's often misunderstood. Grand juries are used when investigators want to compel testimony, protect witnesses, examine sensitive information, and explore leads without public exposure. The fact that one was convened suggests that investigators believe that there was something worth probing deeply. The fact that it produced no indictment suggests that whatever that something was, it did not cross the threshold required to move forward. This is not failure, but it is a boundary, and it shows how close, yet how far, the case may have been at different points. Investigators also reviewed serial offenders active regionally during the early 1990s. Now, this is standard practice, but serial offenders tend to leave patterns. They tend to leave similar victim types. They have geographic comfort zones, usually involving escalation. The Springfield 3 remains an outlier, however. No known serial offender's confirmed pattern aligns cleanly with this crime. That doesn't eliminate the possibility of a serial offender, but it does weaken it. What if the person responsible never appeared suspicious? What if they had no record, no history, no reason to be noticed? Someone who's capable of being calm and someone who's capable of being in control. Someone who committed only one crime successfully and never committed a crime again. These offenders do exist and they are rare, but they are devastating to cases like this. Now, many cold cases benefit from time. Witnesses end up talking, technology improves, and secrets begin to surface. The Springfield 3 suffered from the opposite effect. The witnesses aged, and memories began to blur. The absence of bodies froze forensic progress, and technology cannot test what isn't there. Time can't recover what was never preserved. By the late 1990s, the case reached a deadlock, not because investigators stopped caring, but because all available paths had been explored without resolution. The case was not closed, it was not abandoned, it simply reached the edge of what evidence could support. And that's the hardest place for an investigation to exist. After examining suspects and law enforcement strategy, here's what we can responsibly say. Investigators pursued leads seriously and repeatedly. Confessions and suspects failed under scrutiny. The grand jury indicates meaningful inquiry, not confirmation. There's no named suspect that could survive the legal standards, and whoever committed this crime did not leave usable evidence. This was not incompetence, but it was limitation. In the years after the disappearance, rumors began to circulate. Not online rumors, but local rumors. The kind that persists quietly, pass between investigators, reporters, and people who live near places where something might be hidden. And one of the most talked about possibilities involved property in rural Missouri. Areas where concrete had been poured, where foundations were laid, where structures changed hands, and eventually investigators acted. Multiple excavation efforts were conducted over the years in locations believed at various points to possibly conceal remains. These digs were not theatrical, they were careful, measured, and legally obtained. And yet they produced nothing. No remains, no personal items, no biological trace. And for families, each dig reopened the wound. For investigators, each one closed another door. The absence of discovery didn't disprove foul play, but it did strip away another possibility. One of the hardest things for listeners to accept is this. A case can be real, violent, intentional, and still leave no recoverable evidence, especially when bodies are never found, scenes are contaminated early, and time passing before suspicion hardens. Offenders plan for silence, not chaos, and the Springfield 3 may be an example of a crime that succeeded not because it was perfect, but because it was clean enough. And clean enough is often all it takes. We live in an age where DNA solves decades-old cases. So it is natural to ask, why hasn't science solved this? The answer is brutal in its simplicity. Modern forensic tools need something to analyze. No blood, no remains, no confirmed item handled by an offender. Even if we had perfect DNA databases, advanced AI, and unlimited resources, there is nothing here to test. Technology doesn't replace evidence, it amplifies it. And in this case, the evidence never existed long enough to survive. Officially, the Springfield 3 case remains open. It's not cold, it's open. Now, that distinction matters. It means there is no accepted internal narrative, no quiet resolution, no we know what happened but can't prove it, just a file that refuses to settle. That kind of case doesn't haunt because it's violent, it haunts because it's unfinished. And after all this research, all these years, all these theories, we're left with a short list of questions that still refuse to go away. How was compliance achieved without noise? Why was there no follow-up communication? Why were all personal items left behind? Why is nothing, not a single confirmed trace, ever surfaced? And maybe the most uncomfortable question of all, person responsible, someone no one ever suspected. Not a criminal archetype, not a known predator, not a monster, just someone ordinary enough to disappear back into the world. There is a temptation in cases like this to choose a theory, any theory, just to end the discomfort. But the Springfield 3 punishes certainty, because every time someone declares this is what happened, the evidence refuses to cooperate. As a researcher, the responsible position isn't confidence, but yet it's restraint. Because the truth doesn't need our belief to exist, and our belief doesn't make the truth clearer. Justice is often framed as an arrest, but sometimes justice looks like something quieter, refusing to forget, refusing to simplify, refusing to turn real people into plot devices. Suzanne Streeter was not a headline. Stacy McCall was not a theory. Sherrill Levitt was not a footnote. They were lives interrupted, and that interruption still echoes. The Springfield 3 didn't disappear into the past. It lives on because it exposes something unsettling, that under the right conditions, people can vanish completely. That idea is more frightening than any suspect. There is a house in Springfield, Missouri, where 3 women once slept. On one ordinary night, something entered that space and removed them from the world without leaving a story behind. No violence to point to, no villain to name, no ending to accept, just absence. And absence is harder to live with than answers. Maybe one day something will surface, a confession, a fragment, a truth buried where no one thought to look. Or maybe this case will remain what it has always been, a reminder that some mysteries aren't unsolved because we aren't looking hard enough, but because they were built to disappear. I'm your host, Mr. Bones, and this has been The Night Tales Show. Have a good night.